Welcome everyone to our second online discussion. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Meanjin, Brisbane, which is the country of the Turrbal Yagara people, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that all three of us identify as white and are non-Indigenous, and that we are speaking to you from a place of privilege. And we acknowledge that social and environmental justice issues are very important for Indigenous peoples around the world. And we invite people of Indigenous background to participate in our discussion because that's really important, and we want to encourage that. Social and environmental justice are core values that underpin progressive politics. Broadly defined, social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political and social rights and opportunities. And environmental justice is the view that there should be fair and meaningful involvement of all people in making decisions about environmental decisions and development, regardless of gender, income, skin colour and national origin. For a long time, nuclear technology has been seen as the opposite of these values. This is something members of the Greens for Nuclear Energy Australia want to challenge, and today we'll be aiming to challenge this perception by discussing how nuclear technology can help us achieve social and environmental justice goals, such as stabilising our climate and reducing poverty. My first guest this morning is Dr. Joanne Lackenby, who is the president of the Australian Nuclear Association and identifies as a progressive. Jo, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the nuclear field and why you identify as a progressive?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here today. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Tyrone people. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. A few quick comments before I answer your questions, Tyrone. Just for transparency, I'm not a member of any political party, nor do I get paid to talk about nuclear energy. Anything I say today are my own views, not that of my employer or the Australian Nuclear Association. For those of you who aren't familiar with the ANA, it's an independent scientific organisation made up of individuals with an interest in nuclear science and technology. So a bit about myself. My number one passion in life is the environment, especially getting out into the Australian bush to hike and camp. I have a degree in environmental engineering and nearly 14 years of experience working at the Opal Research Reactor, Australia's only nuclear reactor located in Sydney. How I got into nuclear. So back in uni, part of an engineering degree is an honours thesis. In a nutshell, I did not like any of the topics on offer, but I had this kind of fascination with the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies. So I did my thesis on radioactive waste disposal. What about the waste, right? I wanted to know the answer. After finishing my engineering degree, I took a bit of a detour for 6 years before I came back into nuclear. So over the last nearly 14 years, I've reviewed the evidence, and I genuinely believe that the beneficial uses of nuclear technologies far outweigh the negatives and the risks that also come with these technologies. This is why I'm so keen to be involved in talking about nuclear. Lastly, why I identify as progressive. There's a saying, and I'm sure you've heard of it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm not the biggest fan of this concept. My philosophy is more, if it ain't broke, keep on improving it so that it won't break. We as a community can always do things better. As a progressive, I'm open to new information and changing my mind if needed, and trying to make things better for humans, other species, and the environment. Back to you, Tyrone.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jo. My second guest this morning is Heather Hoff, who is co-founder of Mothers for Nuclear, is an environmentalist and plant operator at the Diablo Nuclear Power Plant in California. Heather, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us about yourself and how you came to co-found Mothers for Nuclear?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking with all of you about this really important issue. And I grew up in Arizona, kind of out in the wilderness without a whole lot of resources. And I guess I could say I was poor. I was pretty poor. We didn't have air conditioning, in Arizona. It was pretty hot. And we had a well that didn't produce much water. And so the way I grew up was always conserving and being efficient and reusing and recycling and composting and just trying to have as least impact on the planet around us as possible. And it's also a small mining town where I grew up. So I felt a lot of, environmental impacts from most of our scenery being tailings piles. And whenever the wind comes up, it's just like dust and quite a mess. So that's how I grew up, and always kind of envisioned California as being, like this green paradise, and really looking up to the green idea of California. So I came here for college, and I have a degree in materials engineering from my local university here, Cal Poly. And when I graduated, I couldn't find an engineering job, and I worked a lot of random jobs around town. I manufactured rectal thermometers for cows for about 9 months. And I worked in a winery during harvest season, and I worked at a clothing store. And finally, I was like, this is ridiculous. I have an engineering degree. I need a real job. And I guess I'll try Diablo Canyon. So that's our local nuclear power plant. It's currently the last one running in California. But I was pretty nervous about it, and my family was nervous about me working there, and I decided to go in and ask lots and lots of questions. And it took me about 6 years of asking questions like, what about this? And oh my gosh, this sounds really scary. Like, what's going on over here? And just constant before I was like, oh, wow, this nuclear is actually pretty amazing. Like I'm generating this huge quantity of emission-free electricity on a really small land footprint. And like, wow, this is actually, really in line with my environmental values and how I grew up in terms of wanting to provide more energy for people so that we can have a better and easier quality of life and with the least impact on the environment as possible. So that's how I changed my mind about nuclear. And when my company, which I'm not representing here at all, these opinions are all my own, just like what Joe said, they decided they weren't going to relicense the nuclear power plant past the year 2025. And when they made that decision, I just felt this incredible confusion. Like I just finally spent all this, time and effort changing my mind and realizing how amazing it is and how great for the climate it is. Why is my company shutting it down? And so that's when I started the nonprofit Mothers for Nuclear to try and speak out about what I've learned about nuclear and why it's such a good thing for providing huge quantities of clean power for people. And I learned a lot about nuclear communications over the last, 5 or 10 years, and realized that our industry doesn't always do it well. And I'm not a professional communicator and I'm not a nuclear engineer, but I would like to share my perspective and what I've learned so far in hopes that other people can change their mind about nuclear too.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather and Joe, for giving us an introduction. I'd like to first start off our discussion with the question, when we say nuclear technology, what kinds of things are we talking about? Because it's more than just nuclear power plants, right? I might start with you, Joe.
Absolutely. There's all sorts of different nuclear technologies and applications of radiation as well that people might not be aware are actually helping their lives and making them better. So there's lots. I'm going to start off with medical. I do work at a research reactor, and one of the big uses of that reactor is making nuclear medicines to diagnose and treat illnesses. So we provide from the OPA reactor approximately We provide approximately 700,000 patient doses each year to Australians to diagnose and treat illnesses. So it's huge. But medical uses go beyond diagnosing and treating illnesses. We also use radioactive sources to sterilize medical equipment. things like syringes, gloves, surgical instruments. So without radioactive sources, we have to find alternative ways to make some of this medical equipment clean. So that's one use of nuclear technologies and radiation, and that's medical.
Yeah, I don't know that many uses. I'm mostly just familiar with power generation because that's what I do. But I have been curious about it and learning. I just read an article, I think this morning, about the use of like irradiating some kind of fruit fly to make it infertile, and then releasing all of these fruit flies to stop. I forget if it was like a crop decimation issue or a disease issue, but there's just so many great things out there that I think it's really lots of possibilities.
Yeah, that's one. We shared that article over the weekend about a fruit fly decimating a crop in Thailand, and they've been able to significantly reduce food wastage and increase exports and things like that, which is great for the local economy. It reduces chemical usage on the crops. So those are really important, environmental and social outcomes that nuclear technology can provide. Another one is that we're really interested in here with our group is desalinization and the possibility of producing large quantities of, clean drinking water and taking pressure off our river systems and things like that. So that's a really interesting one. Do you have any other ones, Joe?
Oh, we'll just talk about science in general. I'm a big passionate supporter of all STEM, but when it comes to science, we do use nuclear techniques and radiological techniques for things like carbon and other dating. We use accelerators and neutron scattering for all sorts of scientific experiments. There's radio tracing too, where you actually trace where radiation is going in the environment to study water levels, atmospheric pollution, so many different things. So as someone who's passionate about the environment, it's interesting that you can use radiation to study and improve the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something that's big here in Australia, but like district heating is another one that's big, important in countries where it's cooler. So Europe, for instance, uses a lot of their nuclear power plants for district heating. I know in the US as well that they use their nuclear power plants for district heating. That's often a byproduct that people consider that, oh no, we have to manage this, but you can utilize that as well for other important things such as industrial uses and district heating and things like that. So there's so much that can be done utilizing nuclear technology, and to take that off the table is really tying one arm behind our back when we're trying to deal with some of these social and environmental issues. The food irradiation and that technology, especially as we're getting climate change, we're seeing more pests push into certain areas, and we're having to manage biosecurity as these kind of insects and viruses. We're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic right now. Ensuring things don't come into regions is crucial, and nuclear technology can help with that. So that's fantastic. So the members of our group largely came to support nuclear energy and technology due to the pressing need of climate change. So how does nuclear energy help us stabilize our climate? Who wants to start on that one?
Go, Heather. You work at the nuclear power plant.
Well, as I said, yeah, nuclear makes a huge amount of emission-free electricity. And right now in the United States, nuclear is about 60% of our clean energy, which is huge. We have about 96 reactors, I believe. And yeah, so I picture, what we could do with even more reactors in terms of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and emissions. And, all the evidence shows that when existing nuclear plants close down, they're replaced with fossil fuels. So I think the best thing that we can do is keep running our nuclear plants as long as possible, and also, plan for more nuclear. And it's truly the best, largest source of clean energy that we can use to replace fossil fuels. And that's how we stabilize climate. And You know, I go to a lot of other social events, you know, women's events, and I think climate change is a women's issue, and I think it's an issue for Native people and disadvantaged communities. They're more adversely impacted by the effects of climate change, and so I think nuclear energy is, you know, a great way to help address those impacts. And I haven't really gotten to this yet, but the research shows that most communities that house a nuclear plant are very in favor of nuclear energy. And I think that's because being close to a nuclear plant, they get access to a lot of public education and information, you know, from the facility, and they learn about it and are able to ask questions and, you know, get comfortable. And I think having a nuclear plant in your own backyard is kind of its own form of like reverse environmental justice. like the nuclear plants get all the good stuff, you know, like it's just really amazing to be a part of a nuclear community.
I think it's been known for some time that nuclear energy has very low carbon emissions. I think that can't be challenged anymore. There's a recent report from the UN that actually puts nuclear as the lowest life cycle carbon emissions out of all the technologies. So we definitely can't ignore nuclear as a source of very low carbon energy. Just recently, it's been identified that you can actually replace coal plants directly with nuclear plants as well, which is being planned to happen in Wyoming in the United States, where they want to replace a coal plant with a Generation 4 reactor. So the most modern sort of design we have available to us at the moment. And it's not just US who wants to do this. Other countries are looking to do it too, including Poland, for example, who, believe it or not, does have even dirtier electricity than Australia has. So when we talk about environmental benefits, you know, if you can replace coal directly with nuclear or directly with some other low source of carbon, that can only be good for the climate. And the good thing about nuclear is it does operate continuously as well. I'm not sure what the capacity factor is like at Diablo Canyon, but in the US in general, they're able to run their plants about 93% of the time at full power, which is pretty good. One other thing when it comes to climate change is we know we're going to have to take as much land as we possibly can and rewild it. So plant trees, encourage species to come back onto that land. Another benefit of nuclear is its low land use. Also in this same UN report, which I'll try to put a link in to the comments if I can find the report. And it also has low materials use. So yes, you do need steel and concrete to build a nuclear plant, and you do need uranium to power it. But this is smaller materials used than other technologies as well. So which means less mining. Less mining means less environmental damage and more land for trees. So it's not just the operational phase of a nuclear power plant. It is the low land use for the site itself, the mining, and also disposal. So right through that the whole life cycle of the technology.
Great, thanks, Joe. I just linked that report in the comments there for you. Yeah, it's a really important report that's kind of snuck in under the radar that has found that nuclear not only has the lowest life cycle emissions, but the lowest life cycle material use, the lowest life cycle land use, lowest life cycle impacts on land and marine toxicity. It really highlights that nuclear has been this really important environmental technology for so long, but it's had this bad rep due to a lot of misinformation, and that leads us into our next topic, which is nuclear accidents. They happen and they can be scary. So how should we be thinking about nuclear accidents? I know, Heather, you have an excellent story about nuclear accidents.
Yeah, they're definitely scary. And I think our industry has done, you know, the public a disservice by not talking about that more openly and acknowledging the fear, because it's definitely scary. Like I said, before I started at Diablo Canyon, I was scared of nuclear and I heard all these stories. And I think our industry has tended to respond to fear by saying like, no, we're safe. And we're so safe because, you know, we do this, and this, and we have all these barriers and we have redundant equipment. And then we have concrete and fences and guys with guns and all this stuff, you know, like we're totally safe. But that's been kind of sending the opposite message, that there's something really complicated about nuclear and something, you know, pretty scary in there, that we have to do so much to manage it. And yeah, so instead of, you know, just saying, yeah, like, yeah, that's kind of like a scary thing, but there's a difference between being scary and being dangerous. And so I think that's a pretty hard lesson to learn and a pretty hard thing to communicate about, which is maybe why our industry doesn't do it. But I have a story about being pretty scared about a nuclear accident. Fukushima, as many of you probably know, happened in March of 2011, and they call it 3/11, you know, kind of similar to our United States 9/11. It was a big deal for the Japanese people, and lots of people were really scared. I was in the control room at Diablo Canyon over, you know, the few days that the event was progressing, and it was very scary. You know, like we had a TV in our back briefing room, and someone pulled the news up, and we see pictures of their nuclear plant exploding. And that is my worst nightmare as an operator, you know, and I'm picturing just right across the ocean from me here from California, here are these other plant operators in the control room with no lights, no indication of what's going on in the plant, you know, like tsunami and earthquake happening, and, you know, wondering, where are my coworkers? Are people safe? Where's my family? I can't get a hold of them. Incredibly scary. And, you know, with the nuclear component on top of that, it's, I just can't imagine what those people were going through. And I myself was like, it's time for me to change careers. Like, I've obviously picked the wrong thing, and this is not what I want to be involved in. And I didn't think this could ever happen. And this is like the worst. I couldn't quite get my head around what was going on. But also being in the nuclear industry and being Diablo Canyon is kind of like a sister plant to the ones in Japan. We share a lot of information and best practices with them, and we shared resources with them during their events. And so we were some of the first to learn what was really going on. And when we started getting actual, you know, data and facts, not just the media, you know, showing things exploding, like super scary, and hearing rumors, there were a lot of bad rumors going on at that point too. But when we finally, you know, learned the truth about what was going on, it was not nearly as bad as what it seemed. So hugely scary, but dangerous, you know, not so much. It was more our human reaction, our fear, and that made the danger. There were about 1,500 people that died during the evacuation, which is incredibly sad to me. If we would have just stayed put, you know, like maybe we could have saved all those lives. And so I think our reaction to nuclear is much more dangerous than nuclear itself, including accidents. And if we kind of look at things with a level head and don't let our fear get the better of us, nuclear is the safest and safer than actually any other way of generating power reliably. So it's a bit of a leap, you know, like emotionally, to think about something that's scary and like kind of turn yourself away from that and be like, okay, but here's what really happened. And
yeah, I think that's such a powerful story, because it's really important to acknowledge, you know, it's natural to be scared.
mm-hmm.
It's a very human instinct to be scared of things that we don't fully understand. And it was a scary time. Like, I remember turning on the TV, watching the tsunami come in, and seeing these whole towns just be destroyed by the tsunami. And because it happened concurrently with the nuclear accident, you know, it's very easy to have the whole event wrapped up around the nuclear accident. And nearly 20,000 people died as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami. You know, whereas no one has died as a result of exposure to radiation. There was one Japanese worker that was declared by the Japanese government as having died as a result of radiation exposure, but that's disputed by the international community. It's mainly to do with the the work regulations in Japan. But I think with the evacuation, I guess there was, after Chernobyl, where they were criticized for not evacuating fast enough, there was kind of an urgency to evacuate quickly so people weren't exposed. And what you were saying about the sharing of information, that's so important. The international, the community around nuclear, not just the industry, but just more broadly, this sharing of information ensures that we're constantly looking at best practice. And maybe, Joe, you can talk to kind of best practice, how we handle things in Australia around safety and things like that.
Sure thing. Just before we go on to that, I agree. Nuclear can be scary. I think it's scary to a lot of people because you can't see radiation, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. It's just, you don't know if it's there. Unless you've got very good, like the right equipment, then it's very, very, very easy to detect. I think what people often fail to remember or realize is that we're actually surrounded by radiation, just living our daily lives. It's there. We've evolved with radiation, and we can cope with some levels quite safely. I'll tell you what's scarier to me, though. I often talk to people, and safety is the number one reason why they don't support nuclear. And that's why they don't get on board with the technology. But in reality, we are living in a world where at least 7 million people are dying prematurely every single year from air pollution, from burning things. So 7 million people plus every year. And this is mostly affecting the poorer people of the world and people who live in densely populated areas. So for me, the risks of nuclear, or the benefits of nuclear, far outweigh the risks to me, because even though, unfortunately, we can never get rid of 100% a risk of a nuclear accident, you're looking at potential for something that could happen versus over 7 million people dying every year. And for me, it's all about perspective.
We should totally be scared of fossil fuels.
We should be.
But we're not, for some reason.
Terrified. We should be terrified of fossil fuels. Yeah, they're not only causing direct harm in the forms of mining and air pollution, but indirect harms by contributing to climate change and the destruction of biodiversity from the mining and extraction of fossil fuels. And all human activity carries a risk. When there's an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico or anywhere in the world, that's way worse than the accidental release of some radiation around Fukushima, for instance. And there's accidents related to materials used for all forms of energy generation, whether that's hydro, solar, wind, etc. There's a statistic showing that more people fall off a roof installing solar panels than die from nuclear over extended period of time. So it's all about managing that risk and putting that risk in context. So yes, accidents can happen. We're not saying that they will never happen, but let's just put those into context of, even the exclusion zone around Chernobyl has become UN recognized biodiversity hotspot. They're trying to preserve that because people are starting to encroach back on that exclusion zone as the radiation disappears. And they're seeing species there that they haven't seen in Eastern Europe for over a century, and they're really surprised that these species have come back. And that's really important that people realize that yes, it may be dangerous to us for a period of time, but for the rest of the environment, it can recover. So
about both Chernobyl and Fukushima, you mentioned the evacuation and the kind of knee-jerk response in Japan, as a result of Chernobyl. And I think even in that case, we didn't necessarily have to evacuate. I think people got thyroid cancer from drinking milk that was contaminated. So we could have just chosen to not do that, probably, if the government had been more open. And in the case of Fukushima, you know, like if they had just not evacuated, I think they would have been fine and better off. I think there's pretty much nothing that could ever happen at a nuclear plant that would justify an evacuation, from everything I've seen and learned and my own experience, you know, on the simulator at Diablo Canyon for, you know, months and months of practice and the craziest scenarios. There's nothing that we could ever do that would ever harm the safety of the public. And it's funny, we were talking about other uses for radiation earlier, and Joe, you were talking about the you know, isotopes for treating cancer and stuff. And I have a friend who had the thyroid cancer, and he posted on Facebook recently, like, oh yeah, you know, like I had to take radioactive iodine to treat my cancer. And I was like, wait, I thought that's what caused thyroid cancer. But I mean, really, like, targeted, you know, radiation is more of a lifesaver than it is a harm to people. And I thought that was really interesting how, like, even I didn't make that connection, that like that's the exact way that we get rid of cancer is like give them radioactive iodine. So I just thought it was
and like the exposure to people surrounding the 3 Mile Island plants was the equivalent to a chest X-ray, and you get more radiation flying across the you know, the continent of Australia or the US than you do living near a nuclear power plant in an entire year. So because
still
you're
scary,
yeah,
but not dangerous.
Still scary, but yeah, not dangerous. You know, it's when you think about it and you don't fully understand the impacts, it's definitely scary, but it's not dangerous. That leads us on to the next question, which is another scary topic for people. That's the waste. Let's talk about waste. What is it? Where is it? And how dangerous is it? Do you want to start, Joe?
What do you think,
Sure,
Joe?
I'll start. So nuclear waste is a hazardous material, that's for sure, but it's a hazard that's pretty easy to control. I think you'd agree with that one, Heather, and also Tyrone.
Yep.
So the best of my knowledge, nuclear waste has never harmed anybody, in the West at least, but please, if I'm incorrect, please correct me on that one.
I think it's fair to say managed nuclear waste, because there has been instances where, say, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was sites that were left unmanaged, and that's a regulatory issue. But please do go on it, Joe.
Yeah, I could be incorrect there, so I need to learn more about this. So just for those of you who aren't too aware of what nuclear waste is, there's 4 main types. So the first one I call exempt waste. So at some nuclear facilities, there's items that are just a little bit contaminated, so they're kept aside until that decays, and then that product goes off-site to landfill or for recycling and things like that. So that is actually the bulk of radioactive waste in some facilities, is stuff that becomes exempt and is disposed of like a normal everyday product. Next, we have low-level waste. So internationally, about 90% by volume of waste is low level. It only contributes about 1% of the radioactivity. So lots of it, not very radioactive. This is things like cleaning equipment, gloves, clothing, tools, that kind of thing. The third type is intermediate level waste. This makes up about 7% of the volume radioactive waste and about 4% of the radioactivity. This is things like resins from nuclear reactors, reactor components, and things that are contaminated components of nuclear reactors when they're decommissioned. And last but not least, when most people say, what about the waste, they mean high level waste. Used nuclear fuel and some leftover products from reprocessing. So this stuff is about 2 to 3% of all radioactive waste by volume. So it's very, very tiny, but it's about 95% of the radioactivity. So it's interesting because when you take nuclear fuel out of a reactor, it actually loses about a large proportion, even as high as 99% of its radioactivity in the first 50 years. So the thing about radioactive waste that you always have to remember is it's literally destroying itself with time. It's decaying, it's throwing off its radiation, it's becoming less radioactive with time. It's usually stored as a solid material as well, so it's easier to manage something that's solid than a liquid or a gas. what else have I got? And when we're talking about used nuclear fuel, we're talking about tiny, tiny volumes. So a uranium pellet from a nuclear power plant is about 7 grams. It's about this big, nice and small. And it'll produce as much power as about 900 kilograms of coal. So when we're talking about waste, we're talking about small volumes. In a system like nuclear waste is extremely well managed. If you think about what the fossil fuel industry does with their waste, for example, they've been allowed to put it into the atmosphere for decades now, and we know that that's causing damage. Nuclear doesn't have that luxury. It has to be managed by regulation, by law, right around the world. And I will stop there.
Do you guys watch The Simpsons? Do you know that cartoon?
Yes, I'm of the right generation for that cartoon.
I'm just asking. I'm intimately familiar because if you do know about The Simpsons, you probably know that Homer Simpson is a reactor operator at a nuclear power plant, and that's my job. So I get a lot of jokes like, "Oh, you're Homer Simpson," and the way that they deal with nuclear waste on The Simpsons is hilarious, but also quite tragic, as it's made a lot of people scared. You know, like he's at the plant, like juggling like these like plutonium fuel rods, and he like drops one down his shirt, and then he like drives away and like throws it out down a drain in the road. And there's always like barrels of like leaking green goo and stuff like that going into the lakes with the three-eyed fish, and it's all very scary. But real nuclear waste, I think it's important to distinguish, is like what you said, Joe. It's a ceramic pellet. And so when we're talking about used fuel, it doesn't leak out of barrels and get into the environment. It's very easy to contain. It's very small, and it's very manageable. And that's what I like to tell people most about used fuel. Like I would put it in my backyard. I would store some in my backyard if I needed to. And it's really small. It's completely contained, and it's never hurt anyone or anything. So it's actually a pretty good kind of waste.
Yeah, and it's really important to put it in context. In terms of the actual amount, you were saying that it's a small amount, Joe, and from the reading that I've done, that there's about 400,000 tons of this high-level waste globally. And to put that in perspective, Australia produces 8 million tons of industrial waste every year. This we're talking 400,000 tons over 60 years, roughly, of civilian nuclear energy production, compared to just 1 year in Australia. That's a huge difference. And they're talking about millions of tons of e-waste coming from wind turbines and solar panels in the coming decades. And that's a waste stream that currently isn't accounted for. It's something we're trying to look at regulations to make manufacturers responsible for that waste afterwards. But the great thing with nuclear is that it's already built into the regulatory framework. And internationally, the international nuclear industry makes sure that that's really managed. And there's some great information from the IAEA about transportation of even low-level and intermediary waste. You know, there's millions of parcels every year transported with this material. And so, you know, it's really important. I've got a great clip here from Ben Hurd, who's an Australian environmentalist and nuclear activist on nuclear waste. So I'll just quickly play that. Of course,
around about now, I expect maybe you're wanting to ask me a little bit about spent nuclear fuel and radioactive waste. Fair question. Let's go and have a look at some. In the mid-90s, the Connecticut Yankee Power Station was decommissioned. And here, what you can see is the entire load of spent fuel for 28 years of operations. That produced in its lifetime from a small nuclear reactor 110 million megawatt hours of electricity with no greenhouse gas emissions. And that's every bit of fuel that was required to do it is sitting there in storage, quietly, happily, causing no one any problems. And I'm sure you'll agree that that's a pretty small facility. Let's just have a look at it in the context of the landscape. It's a pretty place, Connecticut, surrounded by state parks. What you see there, that is the source of decades of anti-nuclear fear-mongering on the basis of spent nuclear fuel. That's it. That's what we've been told to be afraid of. We've been told by generations of anti-nuclear activists to build up in our minds this into such a fearful monster that we have to reject it at all costs. even if the cost might be a habitable climate.
So, that's a really powerful clip from Ben there about, just how much fear and misinformation has been built up around nuclear waste. And it's also important to remember that, radioactive waste and material is generated from other processes outside of the nuclear fuel chain. Even, burning coal releases small amounts of nuclear waste in the coal ash and things like that, or, mining for certain elements. You bring along other elements for the ride, thorium, uranium, etc. And I think people don't fully appreciate that, and that we've been managing that successfully. And where there has been a breakdown, it's been a regulatory issue rather than, a technology issue. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. So the waste issue leads us into a really, pressing topic here in Australia, and that's land. Here in Australia, it's a really important social environmental justice issue, given that the land that we are on, that we call Australia, was never ceded by the First Nations people, and they've been fighting for justice over that since colonisation. And I don't want to speak on their behalf because it's not my place, but I do want to touch on how the nuclear fuel cycle impacts on the land and how that contrasts with other industries. Heather, you work at a beautiful nuclear power plant on the coast. There's pictures of the whale breaching out of the water in the front of your power plant. Can you just run us through what it's, how your plant fits within the land and environment around it?
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely a concern. Diablo is built right smack in the middle of the YTT tribe of the Chumash Indians. And they had about, 10 different villages along the coast from Morro Bay to Avila Beach. And that's about, where the Diablo Canyon lands are. We have about 18 miles of coastline around the plant that are protected. But the power plant was built, right at the site of one of their old historic villages. And I don't have any native roots really that I know of either. So I don't want to speak for them either. But I would think that the best way that we could, repay or make it worth their, sacrifice to give that land would be to give back some of the benefits of having the nuclear plant on their land. Nuclear energy is very, very, cost effective. We make power for about 3 cents per kilowatt hour at Diablo Canyon. As you mentioned, nuclear can be used for so many other things, desalination. We could use it for clean hydrogen production. We could do all these things with this huge source of clean electricity. And I can think of no better way than to, get them involved in the process. And working out there are some members of the tribe that do work at the plant still and help to build the plant, help to pour the foundations of the containment structures. And so I think it's a great, maybe not what they would have chosen to do with their land, but now that it's already there, to share the benefits of the nuclear plant, and also to let them make the choice in the future of, what else, if there's new development of nuclear, what kind they want, how they want to site it, and be involved in the process.
And it has a low impact on the land, I'm guessing, in terms of once the construction is over, there's minimal impact. I think in your A&A talk you were saying there's agricultural purposes that are going on near the plant, and there's wildlife off the coast. There's not this huge impact that people tend to associate with nuclear.
It's largely undisturbed. A bunch of the land south of the plant is leased to ranchers that raise organic beef, and north of the plant is the state park and a docent trail where people can hike down and actually see a view of the plant and overlook. And it's very undisturbed, and I think that's what's made it so well preserved. And that's one of the great things of having kind of an exclusion area around the plant, is all that land is a very low impact, which makes it great for Cal Poly, our local university. They have students come out and do research on the intertidal zones, because they're pristine. And I think there's a biologist from Santa Cruz that said that the lands around Diablo and the intercoastal zones are some of the least disturbed on the entire west coast of the United States, and that's pretty cool. So also, we didn't really talk about like fishing or marine life, but I know, one of my neighbors is a diver, and he said that he likes to go in the waters, off the coast of Diablo Canyon, and he kind of like looks over towards the plant in the area that he's not allowed to go, and he's like, oh, I really want to go over there because that's the best. Like, and all the fishermen are like right around the boundary, kind of like, oh yeah, there's so much good fish there, because like everything is thriving and the wildlife thrives there. And I guess one more quick story about it. I mentioned there's a state park just north of the plant, and we do a lot of partnering with them. We have Earth Day events where we go and do, native habitat restoration and monitor native species like black oyster catchers, and, plant vegetation along trails, and do all kinds of work with them. And one of their state park rangers told me once, she's like, yeah, I kind of wish PG&E, that's my company that owns the power plant, I kind of wish, they would just manage all of this land, because they have some money to do some good stuff, and they have more money than our state park system. So that was kind of an interesting comment. Companies that, own nuclear plants typically take really good care of the land around them. So I think that's great.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Heather. It's great to paint that image for people, because as I was saying, that there's this idea that there's some kind of, bad omen presence around nuclear power plants, and there's, this wasteland exclusion zone where nobody can go. And it's, we're actually talking about plants on really quite compact land spaces with minimal interaction with the environment outside. Joe, do you have anything to add about the nuclear fuel cycle and how it impacts on land, or doesn't impact for that matter?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that every kind of energy generation has some impact on the land. I think we need to acknowledge that all mining causes environmental damage, including uranium mining. Unfortunately, in Australia, we do have some legacy issues around mining rehabilitation not being done as effectively as it could have been, like decades ago, and now trying to clean up some of their sites. But on a positive note, legislation both to protect the environment and also work health and safety laws for miners have all improved to how things were when Australia started mining, probably back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So that's a good thing, including mining rehabilitation. So the Ranger uranium mine in Kakadu was recently closed down earlier this year, and now there's a big program of rehabilitation to try to return that land back to, I guess, as close as possible to a national park status. Something that nuclear does take very seriously is we do a lot of environmental monitoring. I'm sure it's true of Diablo Canyon. In Australia, we're monitoring air, streams, groundwater, just in case there is a problem, we can find it nice and early. And we also go and look at how species are going as well, in terms of contamination from radioisotopes in the oceans as well. So it's very well controlled and managed, and we do take how we impact the environment, including the land, very seriously, and try to minimize that. I said before that some different countries are looking at replacing coal directly with nuclear plants. If we are able to do this throughout the world, what it means is you don't need to build as much infrastructure as you would need to if you're building new sorts of facilities in the outback. So something we don't often talk about is how we might need new transmission lines if we're going to build any kind of facility, whether it's nuclear, wind, hydro, solar, somewhere in a more remote area. We need to get that power, the energy, to people who need it. And that disturbs the land as well. If you can imagine having to build thousands and thousands more power lines, that has an impact on the land as well. So it's not just mining, it's not just the actual site of your facility, it's all the other infrastructure that you need to get that power to where it's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, as we transition to, you know, a net zero, net negative energy society, we're going to have this massive build out of new generation. And it's about doing this sustainably. So we need to look at more than just emissions. You know, as we were talking about earlier, this new UN report says that, you know, we're also, nuclear uses less mining, which is less destruction of habitats, you know, impacts from water and things like that. And land use as well was very low. Like if we're looking at the Australian context, you know, we've got the world's biggest solar farm proposal in the Northern Territory, Sun Cable, and it plans to produce up to 18 gigawatts of solar on 120 square kilometres of land. That's, you know, it's a huge area. The local Indigenous people are concerned about the impacts that's going to have on, you know, the cultural vistas, and something that's not often thought about is, you know, if solar panels get broken, there's water runoff and contamination that goes into the soils and the local waterways. Whereas if you contrast that, you know, nuclear could produce 18 gigawatts reliably 24/7, 365 days a year on just 10 kilometers square of land, you know, and so that's 110 square kilometers that we could potentially rewild and improve and give back to Indigenous Australians if we, you know, weren't doing, and that 120 square kilometers doesn't include the transmission, which you were talking about as well. So, you know, these are huge projects and we need to be thinking about the most sustainable way that we can do that. And I think if we leave nuclear off the table, we're making it harder for ourselves to reach these goals of, you know, reducing emissions, reducing land use, reducing biodiversity and habitat loss. So, you know, I think land is one factor that doesn't get enough attention when it comes to the energy transition. And I think we need to be talking about that more. You know, whose land is it? You know, what impacts does it have on the communities where this development is going on? You know, in New South Wales, there's, you know, opposition to farmland being used for transmission. You know, you've got, you know, 80 meters to 150 meter corridor cutting through people's productive farmland. You know, and we know with climate change, food producing land is going to decrease, you know, as temperatures warm up and things like that. So, yeah, we need a real holistic systems approach, I think, when it comes to energy and land and things like that. And that takes us on to our, does anyone else want to say anything before we move on?
Going to say really quickly, when it comes to land too, when you are talking about the intermittent renewable sources, which are only operating sort of a fraction of the time, you also need to think about the land taken up by the backup system, whether it's a gas system, battery system, hydro, whatever it may be. There's also land considerations there. Whereas for nuclear, because it is operating continuously most of the time, there's much less need for a backup system.
And you only have to build what you need rather than, you know, because of the lower capacity factors with wind and solar, you know, you have to often build 3 times the amount of generation you actually need to hopefully get that generation you do need.
You do need to build a little bit extra nuclear as well, because obviously we do need to shut down to do maintenance in fuel reactors. Okay.
Yeah.
But not 300% more, a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Oh, well, that you know, I just quickly before we move on, that's something that, and it'll feed into our next topic. You know, they're experiencing in Europe, like Germany has built the most renewable energy. They've got 60 gigawatts plus of wind generation installed, but you know, some days they're getting less than 6 gigawatts. So, you know, it's a huge investment in terms of compared to, say, nuclear. You know, nuclear might be more expensive up front. You know, we haven't really touched on cost because it's kind of a bit absent to what we're talking about today. But there's costs associated with other things that might not be put into the upfront cost. So that takes us on to our next topic, which is environmental justice is about fair and meaningful involvement in decisions about development and the environment. We just had COP26 in Glasgow, and whilst there's been some progress made, it still seems very much a case of large developed countries, companies and NGOs, even groups like Greenpeace, dictating to developing countries what forms of energy they can use to power their development. There was Germany was, for instance, was criticised for encouraging African countries to shut down their reliable coal in favour of intermittent solar and wind. And this is despite the fact that Germany isn't even willing to do this at the moment. They've just announced the expansion of a coal mine in Germany. They've actually, told people to get out of this village, and they're demolishing the village for this coal mine to power their power plants. So, is it unfair for developed countries to be saying to developing nations, look, you can only use this wind and solar, which isn't going to provide power, 24/7 reliably to, power your economy and your development, because they have a lot of catching up to do to lift to a standard of living that they want, and they should be allowed to do that. Do you think people globally are being empowered enough to make decisions about energy policy?
I didn't go to COP, but I did hear, that there was some negotiation at the last minute regarding phasing out of coal, because, countries were like, no, we can't phase out coal. We can maybe phase it down. And that was, a big sticking point for a lot of the more developed countries. But I just think we have so much work to do here in the United States. I think we have absolutely no excuse to still be using so much fossil fuels. We have better technology. We have nuclear plus renewables. We could do it all if we wanted to go emission free, and we're not. And so, how is that we could, tell China or Africa or India to, not build coal if we're still using it? And we already have, the technology and the infrastructure. They don't have that yet. They need to develop it. They need to bring their communities out of poverty by giving them more and more energy, and they need to use a lot more energy than they are right now in order to accomplish that. And they need to use whatever technologies are available to accomplish that.
So your question was, are people empowered to make decisions about energy policy? No. Even in Australia, things like nuclear energy, unfortunately, most people don't have a good understanding of what it is, what it does, and that's probably the fault of, I guess, nuclear internationally not communicating in the most effective ways to help people to understand. But Australians, I don't think, in general, have a good understanding of electricity systems, what's needed to go into an electrical grid, for instance, to keep it nice and secure and reliable, and probably don't have a good understanding of some of the limitations of renewable technologies either. I'm very pro-renewable. I'm very pro let's use all the options we have. So I'm not bashing renewables here, but there are some physical limitations, such as solar doesn't work at nighttime, for example. And there's nothing we can do about that unless we put these things in space. So I think Australians have no limited big picture understanding of how much energy we need, how we can generate it, and why it's important that energy system is reliable, and how you can actually make it reliable. So people in general don't have this foundational understanding. How can they be empowered to make decisions about energy policy? So I think we've got a lot of work to do in Australia just to help people understand the basics of grids and how they work.
Yeah, and I think that it's become very politicized everywhere. Going back to COP, for instance, every country is going to act in its best interest. What it sees as its best interest. You've got China looking to invest in nuclear because they want to get out of coal, and they need lots of energy. They've got a large population. A lot of manufacturing has moved there from other countries, and that's very energy intensive. And, you know, it's easy for us in developed countries which have offshored a lot of that manufacturing to say, hey, look, our emissions are going down because we're using this, you know, solar and wind. But, you know, it's very difficult to power a steel smelter or you know, large manufacturing without, you know, this really strong, reliable energy. And typically countries that have been looking to industrialize have used coal, but, you know, if they can use things like nuclear, along with a combination of solar and wind, you know, solar and wind are great for certain applications. You know, if you've got a small village that has a, you know, a low energy consumption, you know, you're not going to necessarily build a 1 gigawatt nuclear reactor there, but, you know, a small solar system with a, you know, battery backup, you know, works great. We've got island communities here in Australia that use, you know, and close to or 100% solar and wind grids. So, yeah, I think every country is going to make those decisions for themselves, and it's important that we make an international framework that allows them to do that without, you know, dictating too much. You know, like, for instance, in the EU at the moment, they're developing their sustainable energy finance, which they call the taxonomy. And, you know, there's some groups, some countries that are trying to force others to not use nuclear. And I think it's important that countries are allowed to kind of make their own decisions about this. And each individual community even is allowed to make their decisions about what they want. You know, I don't think, you know, people in Sydney should have their energy generation policy dictated to them by, you know, someone in, you know, Brussels, for instance, or vice versa. You know, I think every individual community should be having a say about how we progress. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think it's important that any country, every country has knowledge and access to all available technologies, and then let the countries pick what's right for them. I mean, it's pretty hard for Australia to, you know, try to tell other countries what they should be doing if we were going to do that, when we still get 75% of our electricity from fossil fuels and over 90% of our primary energy from fossil fuels. So, yeah,
and a large amount of our export is fossil fuels.
Exactly. So, yeah.
And in terms of enabling individuals to, you know, input to policy decisions, I just think the whole grid is so complicated, and it's really hard for any one person to, like, know enough to be able to say, like, yeah, that's a good idea, or no, it's a bad idea. And I think the best thing that we can do as individuals is, like, really get curious and ask questions about, like, oh, well, if we do this, you know, like, how does that impact all these other variables? And, you know, what are the unintended consequences perhaps of building more renewables? Like, lots of people don't talk about. Joe, I love how you brought up the backup, because we need, you know, backup supplies for when those intermittent sources of generation don't operate. But there's also transmission and distribution considerations. You know, with intermittent sources, lots of times we try and even out the intermittency by connecting stuff more and connecting it over larger distances. And what are the, you know, unintended consequences of that? In California, we had a really bad fire season, you know, for the last few years in a row, and I believe you guys did too in Australia. And more transmission and generation equipment equals, you know, more fire risk. We have all this energized equipment out there, and dry landscapes, you know, more extreme weather events due to climate change. And so if we're going to, you know, build out a grid system that includes a lot more intermittent sources, we have to think about, you know, like, that's part of the cost that we're going to have to manage. And so, like, really get individuals, you know, asking questions and curious about what are all the impacts and what are all the considerations.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. There's all these technologies to choose from, and none of them is perfect. So how you can work them into a system, so you have the lowest overall impact on people and the environment.
Find what we care about and what what kind of things get us which aspects of that, and then how to balance it all. Yeah, it's very complicated.
It is.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of had a little discussion before today's event about, being in your tribe and how, as nuclear advocates on the progressive side of politics, we're a little bit outside of our tribe. I think it's really important that you question your tribe's position on energy. I was saying earlier how it's very divisive. On the right, you've got, coal is good, solar doesn't shine at, work at night and therefore bad. It's not a case of bad or good. It's a case of what works and what helps us achieve the outcomes that we want. And it can be really uncomfortable to question. I know, within the Greens, nuclear is very taboo. And, it's, if you say, oh, the sun doesn't shine at night, they go, oh, you're the same as those shock jocks on the radio. It's, well, no, I just want to have, a curious discussion about what works and what doesn't work. And I think, that really reinforces the point here that we're saying that, get curious, look to the evidence, don't necessarily listen to, the political quotes, the shock jock quotes, because, they're there to get attention. They have a job that they're doing. And, even well-meaning groups like Greenpeace, Friends for the Earth, these environmental organizations, they mean well, well, at least I want to believe that they mean well, but they don't necessarily represent the best interests. There was a clip recently where I forgot his name now, but is it James Hurd? No, not
Hansen?
James Hansen. James Hansen. Yes, asked the environmental NGOs in Canada, why won't you support nuclear? And they said to him flat out, we would lose donors. And that is concerning that they, aren't willing to look at other options because they're worried about a financial stream. And that's something that people don't think about a lot. So we need to constantly be questioning. I think that's really important.
I wonder how much of that is real in terms of donors and whether they really are anti-nuclear, for one thing. But I also hope that we can make progress towards maybe all of those environmental groups. If we make it safe for them to come out and support nuclear, all at once, then that would be great, because like they wouldn't get individually attacked. And I hope we can find a way to help them do that at some point in the near future, because I feel like there's certain individuals within those groups that say, yeah, like I think we need nuclear, but I can't say that publicly because of this board member or that.
That's right. Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to open up to questions in a minute, just being mindful of time. So there's just two more topics. So briefly, nuclear, like many STEM fields, tends to be male dominated or seen as, a male space. What's it been like as women in the nuclear field? Tell us your experience. How can more women get involved? Yay, Mothers for Nuclear. Who wants to start?
Yeah, well, so I started my group, Mothers for Nuclear, partly because our industry is so male dominated, and I wanted to emphasize that mothers and women can learn about nuclear, can share about nuclear, and can support nuclear also. It's typically, I work with a bunch of men in the control room. I work with a bunch of like male operators, engineers, security guards. Lots of those fields are very male dominated. And I think having more diverse messengers about the topic of nuclear is really important for other people to feel comfortable asking questions and, not being told like, listen here, sweetheart, this is how it works. Like no female wants to be told that. And I feel like that's been like our typical industry communications in the past. We just kind of, tell people this is how it works. This is radiation. It doesn't hurt you. This is how, the plant works. Here's like how all our equipment works. And like, do you understand? And like, why not? And so, yeah, I think, it's time for mothers and women and, young female engineers and women in STEM and all these other groups to speak out in support of nuclear energy and make it more accessible to other mothers and women who maybe aren't in the field and can't spend 6 years working at a plant asking questions to try and understand it. Like they have someone to go to who's a reliable source that cares about what they care about.
There is this awesome organization called Women in Nuclear. There's an awesome organization called Women in Nuclear. So if anyone hasn't heard about it, it's a global organization, chapters throughout the world, thousands of members, and you can actually be any gender to join. You don't need to be a woman or identify as a woman. One of the objectives of this organization is to try to increase dialogue with members of the public about peaceful nuclear technologies. And this is because it's been identified and it's been happening for decades that when you do polls, it's often women who are less supportive of these technologies than men. So I think we need role models right across different ages, genders, backgrounds, nationalities, etc., to go out there and advocate more for nuclear. I have noticed, I work for the government, and when you work for the government, there tends to be good safeguards around discrimination, harassment, and diversity inclusion is a big thing. And I know that my organisation is going to great lengths to try to increase diversity of employees within the organisation. Something I have noticed is that there is a fairly large discrepancy between the genders when it comes to nuclear advocacy. So on Twitter, for instance, most advocates that I see are male. There are some very, very good female ones as well. It'll be good to see a few more out there, though.
We're getting there. We're growing gradually, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the best, communicators on Twitter are, women working within the field. Yourself, Heather. Heather. Geez, if I can get my words out. Yourself, Joe, and we got people like Xeon Lights in the UK who has started Emergency Reactor. She's been on our TV a few times here in Australia. I think it's great to see more diverse people getting involved in this advocacy. There was a flash mob that of nuclear activists at COP26, and they kind of got stomped on Twitter, sadly by some Greens MPs globally, and I think it really shocks people that there's young people, there's such diverse groups. You had people of different backgrounds there. They're coming out for nuclear because we're facing these really big challenges around climate change. So it's great to see. Just quickly before we go to questions, can you summarise for me why nuclear fits with your progressive values?
I said at the start, if it ain't broke, keep on improving it so that it doesn't break, right? And I see that nuclear is doing exactly this. It's evolving. So there's huge innovations going on, both in the technology and also sort of looking at how we can improve the safety culture of the people working in nuclear plants, although I think it's pretty good. So the nuclear energy of the 2020s is nothing like nuclear energy of the 1960s. They're worlds apart from my perspective. It's such an exciting field. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that I think the general public of the world often doesn't get to hear about. There's small modular reactors, there's generation 4 reactors, there's nuclear waste recycling, which we didn't get to talk about today, and nuclear fusion as well, like all these amazing things going on. And because nuclear is evolving, trying continuous improvement is something we all is very, very encouraged in the nuclear industry. It's progressive.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, Joe. How about you, Heather?
Yeah, well, I just nuclear makes such a huge amount of power, with no emissions on such a small land footprint, and there's so many great things about it that I find it hard not to support it now. And something that I kind of changed my mind on, from when I grew up, is the amount of power that we should be using and the quality of life that we should be striving for. And, it's hard growing up with very little resources and conserving everything and trying to use less. And I think people, want to leave a light on in the other room instead of, like run back and forth and, turning stuff off. And like, I do that at neighbors' houses when they leave lights on, I like turn them off for them. But it's exhausting. That's just a really small example. But, I got really frustrated over the years when I realized that I couldn't convince other people to behave like that, to behave how I wanted them to behave. People don't really want to change their quality of life and, go backwards. They want to use more electricity. They want to cook in the evening during peak hours. They want to use their washing machine and their dryer instead of washing stuff by hand. And like all of that stuff makes our lives better. And so I think the more power we can use to improve quality of life, air conditioning, food refrigeration, medical facilities and data centers and stuff, that we should be using electricity for that. And nuclear is so great because it's so clean and so powerful. So that's what I love about nuclear.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Heather. Just for myself and for the Greens for Nuclear Energy here in Australia, our position is really that, we have to move to electrifying everything. Get away from burning stuff to produce our energy, and that's going to require vast amounts of energy, as not just in developed countries, but at these developing countries. There's some cities in the developing world that are half the population of Australia. They're just emerging and requiring energy. And nuclear offers that, with less material throughput, less land, the lowest emissions, and it can help us, with other processes as well, desalinization. We were talking earlier, irradiation, biosecurity, medicine. There's just a whole range of applications that help contribute to the high standard of living that we enjoy now, in our countries, and that hundreds of millions of people want to get to that standard of living, and it's our obligation, I think, in developed countries to help them, especially since historically we're the largest emitters and we've ridden the back of fossil fuels. We can't just say to them, well, don't develop to our standard, use these lesser technologies. So that's really our position and why we feel that nuclear fits within progressive values. It's fantastic that we're able to have these conversations, and I think that's really important. So we're just going to go to questions now. We have one question from Alyssa, and their question is, what are your thoughts on how nuclear power in particular impacts communities of colour, and how can we do better? I mean, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but do you have any responses to that?
I think it's a positive impact, and you might have heard of negative impacts, but I think those are largely like a fear-based response, and that if you have a nuclear plant in a community of color, that would be great, and that would give so many great jobs to people that probably need them and want them and would appreciate them. And also, a nuclear plant is usually like a large economic driver for the area that it's in, so it creates other jobs, implied jobs, and I see it as being a benefit. So I guess I did hear someone say recently that it was a social justice concern that nuclear plants are largely built in white affluent communities. So those communities are more likely to get all the benefits from that nuclear plant. So that's a little bit of a social environmental justice issue. And so I'd say, like, if you want to even that out, advocate for a nuclear power plant in that community, and that's how we would fix it.
I think we should acknowledge that in the past there were some negative impacts on some particular groups, especially decades and decades ago. Unfortunately, it happened, and I guess what we can do now going forward is making sure that when we do want to build new nuclear plants, that we have the thumbs up from the local communities.
Yeah.
The social license is very, very important. So communities advocating for these facilities and all the benefits that come with it is very, very important, not just for nuclear, but for any new development, even wind farms and solar farms. It's very important to get community consent before you go and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, showing respect. You know, you were saying decades ago we've had mining accidents because the regulation is less in communities of color, because it's like, well, you know, no one really cares about those communities, and that's a real problem with our attitudes, not necessarily the technology. And I think it's really important that we show greater respect and understanding for those communities and all people going forward. Another thing that I would point out is that traditionally communities of color have been forced into areas around, you know, fossil fuel generating power plants because the land value is lower, it's higher air pollution, excuse me, and it impacts on their well-being. And if we can displace fossil fuels more quickly with nuclear, then those communities aren't being impacted so heavily by, you know, air pollution and things like that. So I think there's, you know, a lot of benefits here. And it starts by acknowledging that these communities have been disadvantaged in the past, and by, you know, the need to do better by them going forward. So another question we have here is, excuse me, how do you see nuclear being playing out in the next election? This is probably more Joe specific. Any chance that major parties might push for legalization in Australia? It would be a great opportunity to educate the public. What do we think?
Oh, geez. Just to reiterate, I don't belong to any political party and have no affiliation with any political party. So it's a tough one. But what I can say is that there is internationally established guidance from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's called the Milestones Approach, which takes you through 3 milestones for countries looking to set up a nuclear program. And if Australia chose to do so, we could start that milestones approach without even having to worry about removing a legislative ban. So we could start to do the thorough investigations as to whether nuclear really is right for this country. And then at the end of that process, if the decision is yes, this is a great idea for the country, then we can remove the ban fairly easily because we've got the evidence backing it up. It's a huge political issue. It's very polarized. And we'll see if it becomes a political issue. I kind of hope it doesn't, because we can do the work we need to do to set up a program without having, I was going to say, 2 sides warring with each other, but it's a lot more complicated than that, that's for sure.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say, Heather, like in terms of politics in your country? Where does
definitely. Well, Trump was a supporter of nuclear, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. And now that we have the Biden-Harris administration and they're pro-nuclear, it's a huge win, I think, to have, like, it's a bipartisan issue now, definitely. We just passed some legislation that includes, you know, lots of help for clean energy and the Build Back Better plan. And I think that was just last week. And in that there's, you know, help for both existing nuclear plants and for advanced nuclear. So it's great to see our more like liberal and democratic party supporting all forms of clean energy. So I think it's great progress. Very excited.
Yeah, I think that's really important for Australia as well. We tend to look to the US and see what's happening there politically. You know, the Australian Labor Party is similar politically to the Democrats. Excuse me. So I think the Democrats going nuclear and recognizing their error in judgment all these decades is really, you know, they've actually come out and acknowledged that. So I think that's really important for people on the left here in Australia and progressives to say, hey, look, this is happening in the US. Maybe we should be looking at that here. The last question that we have here is, how do we do activism for nuclear and get outside our echo chambers. Heather, do you want to start?
Let's see. Well, I guess that's the whole reason that I started a nonprofit, and partly why I called it Mothers for Nuclear, is to capture attention of people who might not normally pay attention to nuclear or energy issues. It's funny, when we first started the organization back in 2016, one of our very first interviews was with Climate Wire, and the reporter, he's like, so your group is called Mothers for Nuclear. And then he's like, wait, hold on just a minute. And he like put us on hold. And then he came back and he's like, everyone in my office is laughing. like there could be such a thing as a mother for nuclear. And I just thought it was very telling, that people don't really expect, I guess, I think every voice is important in advocacy, and there's a lot of different groups now that maybe have more extreme opinions, and some that are in the middle, and some coming from, the angle of mothers caring for the future, and some coming from like nuclear barbarians or more technical aspects. And I just think every voice is so important to reach everyone who should care about clean energy, which is all people. Like, we all use energy, and we all have a better quality of life the more energy we use. And yeah, so I guess how I do advocacy is I support every other nuclear advocate, regardless of whether I agree with their type of messaging or not. I think they're all important, and maybe that's not how I would do things or how I would talk about it, but we're all different, we're all important. So the more we talk about it, the better.
I guess my time spent on social media, especially Twitter, it's interesting because a nuclear advocate is people like the three of us, people who just genuinely care about the environment, about making lives better for people, improving the world. I don't see too much lobbying going on. There might be some, but it's mostly just grassroots, passionate people who are trying to change perspectives and educate people and have conversations about this particular technology. It's fascinating because the three of us, I don't think any of us are getting paid to do this today. We don't get paid to advocate.
That should be nice.
Show me the money. Show me the money.
Anyone listening, the three of us here are willing to accept payment. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, it's just people who genuinely care and want to make the world a better place. And I think when a lot of people think nuclear, they think lobbyists and big money behind us doing these things, and there's not.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that, I've doing this advocacy. I'm working with people from across the political spectrum, people that I wouldn't necessarily work with on other issues because they're opposed to those to my position on those issues. But I think it's really important that we are respectful and keep the discussion focused on the facts and the issue at hand, and reach out across those political lines, those tribal lines, to have this discussion, because it's so important, because of the threat of climate change and biodiversity loss and all these a whole range of issues that we're facing. It's important that we reach out. And our first event was with Atta Hajani from the Finnish Greens, and how they changed their position was just very respectful discussions and stories around the facts, that like we're having today, that nuclear is scary, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's dangerous. Or, there is waste, but, how do we put it in context? And what are the other, technologies and how we, climate change is this bigger threat, and how do we deal with that? And I think it's just really important that we have respectful discussion, and it's easy to break down into our tribes and get heated. It's a human thing to get heated in discussions, but I think it's really important to take a really calm, respectful approach. And I thank you both for joining me today. for the Greens for Nuclear Energy Australia discussion. And I hope that we can speak again soon and keep promoting discussion around this. So thank you to you both. And thank you to our and thank you to our audience for participating with questions and watching our discussion today. And make sure to like the page and share this video with your friends and family and keep the discussion going. So thank you to you both, and thank you to the audience. Catch you later. All right, so the live video is over. How do you guys think that went? Well, ladies, how do you think that went?
Are you sure? Because it still says live on my screen.
Yes, it will run for a few more seconds.